Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, me, Cyndana Putri Kinasih, and my friend Laela Nur Fahmi will be presented about measuring and anticipating economic exposure. But first of all, I would like to say thank you to Mrs. Melisa because the opportunity we can present it today, and also I hope you guys in a good health condition today. Can I start the presentation? Okay, so first, the introduction. In today's global economy, exchange rate fluctuation have become increasingly unpredictable. Change in economic policies, geopolitical tensions, and global economic slowdowns have created a high level of global uncertainty. Exchange rate movements do not only affect international transactions but also influence a company's competitiveness, cost structure, and long-term performance. Even firms without direct foreign transaction can be indirectly affected through market competition. Therefore, understanding and anticipating economic exposure is essential for companies to remain competitive in an uncertain global environment. Next to the what is economic exposure? According to Madura 2013, economic exposure refers the sensitivity of the firm's cash flow to exchange rate movement. And how can it affect the firm's cash flow? The value of a firm cash flow can be affected by exchange rate movement if it executes transactions in foreign currencies, receive revenue from foreign customers, or is a subject to foreign competition. Some people say it like, what is the difference between transaction exposure, economic exposure, and translation exposure? So, the first is transaction exposure is the sensitivity of the firm's contractual transaction in foreign currencies to exchange rate movement. And for the economic exposure is the sensitivity of the firm cash flow to exchange rate movement. And for the transaction exposure of the MNEs or multinational companies consolidated financial statement to exchange fluctuation. So the transaction exposure it focus on the contract transaction. For the economic exposure is for the sensitivity of the firm cash flow to exchange movement. And for the translation exposure is for the financial statement of the companies. Okay, move to determinant of economic exposure. We have four determinants. They are industry structure and market characteristic, such as competitiveness and demand elasticity. And the second one is characteristic of company operation, such as international involvement and location of production and markets. And the third is financial factor, such as cost and revenue structure. And the fourth or the last is macroeconomic factor such as external environment influencing pricing strategy and market conditions. Now, how we measure the economic exposure? According to Madura 2013, economic exposure is measured by examining how sensitive a firm cash flow and value are to change in exchange rate rather than relying solely on accounting data. He emphasized two main measurement approaches. The first one is sensitivity analysis. This approach estimates a firm cash flow under different exchange rate scenario, such as currency appreciation or depreciation, to assess the potential impact on the future profit and cash flows. And the second one is regression analysis. This method uses historical data to statistically measure the relationship between exchange rate movement and firm performance, where the regression coefficient represents the degree of economic exposure. In essence, Madura highlight the economic exposure should be measured using a forward-looking approach, combining managerial scenario analysis with data-driven statistical analysis to better understand the long-term effect of exchange rate fluctuation.
Okay, we move on to impact of economic exposure for company. Economic exposure have long-term implications as they affect a company's cash flow and competitive position, not just momentary transaction. For the first, exchange rate changes can cause decrease in real revenues when the domestic currency strengthens for exporting companies, and increase in imported input costs when the domestic currency weakens. As a result, profit margin become unstable even if sales volume does not change. The second impact of price competitiveness. Exchange rate affect the relative price of product in the international market. Companies with domestic production costs will be less competitive when the domestic currency appreciates. Conversely, currency depreciation can increase price competitiveness but risks raising import costs. Thus, economic exposure determines a company's ability to compete globally. The third, impact on long-term investment decision. Exchange rates uncertainty affect foreign market expansion decision, production site selection, and fixed asset and technology investment. Companies with high economic exposure tend to be more conscious in making long-term strategic decisions. In simple terms, in exporting companies, there will be an appreciation of the domestic currency which affect the price of the product more expensive, causing demand to fall. While in the importer company, there is a depreciation of the domestic currency which causes the cost of raw materials to rise so that profits are depreciated. Okay, next is possible strategies for hedging economic exposure. According Madura 2013, companies can develop strategies to reduce risks among others. First, pricing policy. At some point in the future, the company should try to be more competitive by lowering prices. Although this strategy can maintain market share, lower prices will generate less revenue and thus reduce cash flow. The second, hedging with forward contract. Company A can sell to another company, its company B, on a future basis for the period in which they want to hedge against the adverse impact of another weak company. The third, purchasing foreign supplies. Buy its raw materials from another company like Company C, a strategy that will reduce costs and increase cash flow during the period of weak Company B and thus offset the adverse impact of weak Company B. The fourth, financing with foreign funds. By financing part of its business with loans in euro, the company can convert the loan proceeds into dollars and use those dollars to support its business. The last, revising operation of other unit, limited in hedging the exposure of company A by adjusting the operation of that unit. It may consider modifying the operation of other units in a way that will offset the exposure of company A to the exposure of company B. Now we have a case of hedging economic exposure. Sever CO, a U.S. firm, is primarily concerned with its exposure to the euro. It wants to pinpoint the source of that exposure so that it can determine how to hedge it. Sever has three units that conduct some business in Europe because each unit has established a wide variety of business arrangement. It is not obvious whether all three units have a similar exposure. Each unit tends to be independent of the others, and the managers of each unit are compensated according to that unit's performance. Safar may want to hedge its economic exposure, but it must first determine whether it is exposed and the source of the exposures. So, what does Sever Company do? First, assessment of economic exposure. Sever applies regression analysis to determine whether the percentage change in its total cash flow is related to the percentage change in the euro value. According to this analysis, the slope coefficient is positive and statistically significant, which implies that the cash flow are positively related to the percentage change in the euro. That is, a negative change in the euro adversely affects Sevor's total cash flow. The second, assessment of each unit's exposure. To determine the source of the exposure, Sever applies the regression model separately to each individual unit cash flow. This result suggests that the cash flow of unit A and B are not subject to economic exposure. However, unit C is subject to economic exposure. Third, identifying the source of the unit's exposure. Now, that Sever has determined that one unit is the cause of the exposure, it can pinpoint the characteristic of that unit that caused the exposure. Sever believes that the key components that affect unit C cash flow are income statement items such as its US. This result suggests that when the euro weakens, the unit's revenue from US customers declines substantially. Several US customers shift their demand to foreign competitors. It can obtain imports at a low price. Thus, the company's economic exposure could be due to foreign competition. Okay, last conclusion. Economic exposure is a long-term strategic exchange rate risk that affect a company's cash flow, profitability, competitiveness, and value. Measuring economic exposure is important so that companies understand the sensitivity of their performance to exchange rate fluctuation and can make more informed decisions. Therefore, the anticipation of economic exposure is not only done through financial instruments but also through operational strategies such as market diversification, cost structure adjustment, price flexibility, and product innovation so that companies are able to survive and remain competitive in the face of global economic uncertainty. That's all the presentation from our group. I hope the topic can absorb the knowledge from the material we conveyed. Now, entering the question and answer session, we open a discussion session. If you have any question, you can send it in the WhatsApp group. Thank you so much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.